Thank you all for coming. The structure of the presentations is that I will start by giving a general overview of the ERA, show you a few of the statistics and so on. And of course, now that I'm an emeritus professor, although I was a former Deputy Vice-Chancellor here in the university, I'm not at the pointy end anymore in terms of actually having to deliver the results for a university and so on. But my colleagues, of course, Lyndon Kristjanson was at Curtin University of Technology and had the responsibility there in terms of the 2010 exercise, and now 8 weeks she has been the Vice-Chancellor and President of Swinburne University, and so it's a great delight to have her here to tell us both about the past experience but also what it means. And of course Jim McCluskey is our Deputy Vice-Chancellor here at the University of Melbourne, very eminent researcher in the immunological space. I suppose, Jim, you didn't quite have the mainstream responsibility for 2010. I guess it was it fell to your predecessor to do that. But Jim certainly was very much involved and has the responsibility for the 2012 exercise. So, as I said, I'll deliver an overview. Linda will then follow straight through and make her presentation. Similarly, Jim, unless you've got an absolutely burning question, what we're proposing is that we'll certainly get through all of that part by within an hour, possibly a little less, and then we've set aside approximately an hour for general discussions, any burning questions you have, and as you'll see as I go along, I will also provide you with some questions perhaps that we'll come back to. So without further ado, the overview, I thought I'd just start by giving, in case you're not all absolutely familiar with the ERA, just a few facts that in fact the exercise, there were 41 institutions, 39 of which are universities. There was the School of Divinity here in Melbourne and the Bachelor Indigenous College were the other two, and so largely they were very specialised institutions as such. The units of evaluation, it was quite a massive exercise, and those of you involved would have some familiarity with this. Something like 2,400 what were known as units of evaluation were presented by the universities for assessment, and the way they were clustered is using the Australian and New Zealand research classification system, which basically, and I'm not going to go into too much detail here at all, but there are 22 two-digit codes and 156 of the four-digit codes, so that you pick up the mainstream discipline, but you also pick up the sub-disciplines as well. And universities could choose to submit in as many or as few as they wanted. And then for the assessment, because this is a large task and obviously you need some calibration of the validity of what is being done. So the ARC had 8 what were really research evaluation committees, and they clustered these 22 codes. In fact, some were split, so there were actually 25 codes that you could submit into 8 clusters as such. And then the items, the research papers and so on, something over 330,000 unique research outputs were assessed. So you can see the size of the task. 55,000 researchers were involved. So in terms of the comprehensiveness of this exercise to about the standing of Australian science and humanities, social sciences, medicine, so on, it really was pretty comprehensive. And of course it rated things, as most of you would know, from either 1, which was the lowest, well below world standard, to 5, which was really well above world standard. So this is the kind of reference, the metrics, the reference points that we ultimately got. And the estimated cost is very substantial, but certainly commentators say it probably cost at least $100 million to undertake the exercise. So of course the question is raised by many people, well, was it worth it? I'll not go through this, just to remind you though, what we've been talking about is the comprehensiveness, and at the 2-digit code level, as you can see, mathematical sciences, physical science, chemical sciences, so on, all the way through to the philosophy, religion, and then the clustering into 8. This is relevant because of what I'm going to say in a moment, without a great deal of detail, that there were 8 clusters as such. So this really spans all of the research activities, and we all had the challenge of putting our research into appropriate clustering there. All of this is in detail on the web if you want it. So what did we learn? I just show you a couple of slides here, and I don't intend to overwhelm you here. But the first question you can say really is what are the disciplines in Australia where universities are most active? Well, in fact, there are 39 universities, and in fact the codes, the humanities and the social, behavioural and economic sciences, actually pretty well all universities, as you can see, these are above 35 of the universities have submitted. The only outlier in this is the medical sciences actually come in here. Well, there's the biological and the medical sciences, but in fact most of this is the humanities, social sciences and so on. So when you look at how comprehensive the universities are, this is where the breadth at least is shown. When you come to the sciences, which is approximately from here down with all of these codes, you've got about 25 down, and it tails away to about between 20 and 25 universities chose to submit. We have to be a bit careful because universities might be doing some science but chose not to submit, of course, for evaluation. But in fact, this does tell us something about the diversity of the Australian system as such, and it's, I think it's a very important reference. The other thing is to say, how did we perform? And of course there's myriads of statistics here, and all I've done is to take for each of these particular codes, the 2-digit codes, is to look at the percentage of universities. As I said, in some cases 35 universities, in some other cases 25 universities, were assessed at or above world standard in each of the codes. And again, the striking thing is slightly the reverse of, if you like, the diversity, where the humanities, social sciences, the most diverse. In general, is particularly the ones that have done particularly poorly on average, of course, have been the social and the behavioural and the economic sciences, which are in here. Humanities, around, you can see around 50% to 60% were at or above world standard, and you come to the biological sciences, the physical sciences, in particular the earth sciences here, where the greatest strengths are. How you interpret this, of course, is another question, but these are the factual situations. So when you look at the 8 cluster level, and again, aggregate the figures to say, of course, the average quality rating is 3 is equal to a world standard. The interesting thing is that actually only 4 of the 8 clusters overall, for all the universities average, actually meet that world standard as such. And again, it's the sciences in here. Interestingly, the mathematics and the information sciences are just below 3, and then the medical sciences, which one sees as being, you know, our premier area, in fact, because of the code, which does include nursing and some of the paraclinical sciences and so on average, actually comes out to below world standards. And then, as I said, the social and humanities one as well. So at that level, you can see we have a very mixed bag again in terms of performance. But having said that, we mustn't overlook that in all of these areas in Australia, we have some really world-class universities. And so what I'm showing here is the percentage at or above world standards for universities. And so, for example, in the humanities, 58% of the universities that presented had a 3 or better as such. On the social sciences I've mentioned. When you move to the physical sciences, 92% of all all of the universities that presented were at or above world standard. And those, the other purple here is where the score is in fact 4 or 5, which is well above in that sense as such. And so, as I said, while the other graph looks a bit pessimistic, these are averages, and we do have world-class universities in all of those areas. And this is illustrated here. This is looking at all the universities, looking at, again, the number of two-digit fields that were research evaluated as such. And in fact, you can see that the diversity for universities, the previous one I showed you was the diversity for the disciplines. If you now come back to the universities and say how diverse are those, it's interesting to note that, of course, the group of 8 I think is probably not a great surprise. Of the 25 possible codes, one of them was in a technology code where only one university presented, so 24 was pretty much the maximum. So we have the group of 8 presenting in 24, 23 or 22 codes, and ANU, which is a smaller in 21. But the interesting thing is that you have QUT, Griffiths, Curtin and Deakin are also presented in something like 22, and so they do have quite a diverse profile. And then you can see for yourself it tails off down to Notre Dame, finished up I think with just 6 areas as such. But again, it provides us with an insight into the diversity that we have in Australia. Now you can do the same thing and say, well, okay, that's fine, that's the diversity. How have they performed? Well, the interesting thing is, of the 39 universities, again, this is an average across all the codes that they submitted in. In fact, we have only 12 of the 39 universities are in fact at or above world standard by this 2-digit code. And ANU, these are just numbers and they hide a whole lot of other things, of course, but ANU does outrank all other universities just on average across those. And in fact, the 12, the last one, which on average would be seen as world standard, is UTS, and it's the similar universities to what I referred to. Basically the group of 8, and then now it's Macquarie, QUT, Griffiths, and UTS in that particular. And then again it goes on down, and they're below 3 there, even though the other way of looking at this is simply to look at the number of 2-digit fields that are at or above standard for universities, whereby you separate out the 5s, which are absolutely well above world standard. The 4s, these are cumulative, so this is 4 plus 5 that are above, and then the ones that are at world standard. And again, if you look at it, the 12 I've been talking about, of course, are the 12 up here, and it tails right away, although it's very interesting that a whole lot of universities in fact receive quite a number of 3s, but you've got half the universities and so that really got little more than a 3, maybe in one discipline had a 4 or a 5. So this is the kind of information, and you can play with these numbers a great deal, but that kind of information. So they raise a series of questions, I think, which I'm going to leave you with, and then we'll come back to at the end after my colleagues have presented these questions and others. The first thing I think that these are questions which sort of present themselves to me, and you may have other ones which you want to raise. But you know, firstly, what have we learnt from the ERA exercise, and how will the outcomes actually influence research management practices and profiles in universities going forward? Because this exercise is transformative, there's no doubt it will change the face. How will that happen? What will it do? The thing that this all begs the question for me, because of what is world standard anyway. That was not disclosed by the ARC. That is confidential information, and in fact one is not able to access it. So there is a question, I think, for this to be a truly effective process going forward, and maybe in the 2012 exercise we'll learn some more of this. Basically, we need to know more, I think, about what are the world standards in these 22 fields. What did these research evaluation committees use, and how valid are they for what they've done? And again, if we use this as some measure of the international standing of our universities, how valid is it again? So we could use it domestically, but equally it's going to impact internationally. We can't deny it. We know that rankings are a reality and so on. The people who do the rankings are going to look at these things and what implications does it have there. Furthermore, what are governments and the community going to say about this? Are we explaining it adequately to the community and so on? These are the kind of things I hope in our seminar discussion we can raise. What were the flaws in the ERA from your point of view, and how can we improve the exercise for 2012? I mean, Jim tells me that the discussion paper's just been released today, I gather, in relation to 2012 exercise. I haven't had a chance to see that yet, but in fact, what change have been proposed? Will we have globally stronger universities as a consequence? We know how important this is to the image of Australia's tertiary education, how important it is for the recruitment of international students, recruitment of staff into all our universities. What's it going to do for us? And furthermore, where does interdisciplinary research fit into this whole thing, and the questions of innovation and so on? Is it adequately covered or not? How do we deal with that? And really, will this encourage good or bad behaviour in universities? Will there be increased concentration? Will there be what I think these are actually James's words and not mine in this last question, a research transfer market for academics? Will in fact, as we see in the RE exercise that occurred in the UK, are we going to see some more of those kind of practices occurring? Who knows? All right, so that's just an overview which I present. We're going to move straight on to invite Linda to give her presentation, and then Jim, and then, as I said, we'll come back to those and other questions you may like to ask. So thank you very much indeed, and I'll invite Linda to take the podium. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. And thank you so much, Richard, for the opportunity to be present here tonight and to contribute to this discussion. I think we've never been at a more interesting time in higher education and in research. And we really need to be having more of these discussions so that we can unpack some of the issues and examine them in a really forthright way. So it's a privilege to be here tonight. I've been in Melbourne 8 weeks, and I'm loving my new life here and the intellectual energy that this community offers in terms of higher education discussions. It's an important discussion, and no doubt we will have a very robust conversation as the evening proceeds. Rankings usually result from a scrutiny of the work of intelligent people who generally make a living out of questioning everything on the planet. So there's so therefore, as a result, we would expect that the rankings are always going to face a fair bit of painstaking criticism. Where's Leanne Harvey? Yes, right. You've had to bear the brunt of that, so any complex questions will go to Leanne. But my view here tonight is to say, first of all, very simply, that the ERA exercise has really changed the way in which we see ourselves and start to understand each other. I don't think that this conversation is finished. The first round of ERA was a learning exercise. It was meant as a trial, which was why funding was not tied to it. And it helped us to try and bed down what that process might be, helped us to understand how we might understand our own work and how we could participate. But it's definitely here to stay. I think the other thing that I would say is that it will require further discussion and understanding and much more consideration of how we interpret those numbers and those findings. And the most important part of the discussion from my point of view is that it will prompt us to consider what we have not yet measured. One thing that I would say coming into this conversation is, besides having lived through the first round of ERA as the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research at Curtin, my former life was as the inaugural chair of palliative care funded by the Cancer Council of Western Australia. And my PhD was in palliative care. And one of the things that many people might not realize was that I received a scholarship from NIH to look at the whole area of measurement in the complex field of palliative care. So measuring difficult things like pain and quality of life probably started to resonate with me as I was trying to get my head around how do we measure things like quality in research. And so I've certainly had some experience looking at that thorny question of how do we measure validity and reliability when we're trying to measure such complex phenomena. Let me say a little bit about research rankings, what they offer and what they don't. Now, I think as Andres Rovgager said, it's a quick answer to a complicated question. And when the European University Association presented its first study on international university rankings just recently in June, the media across the globe were quick to reduce the conclusions of the complex and thorough document to the summary, rankings are useless. In effect, they did the same thing as the author, Andreas Rovagers, argued that they did when the media and politicians embraced the rankings in the first place. He said they are trying to seek a quick answer to a complicated question. Now, the public debate on rankings around the world has really globalized people, polarized people everywhere. Many academics will consider them rubbish and not even worth having a good debate, while other highly ranked universities, you always have to be careful who you're listening to, media and politicians will quote them liberally, feeding the development of more and different and differentiated rankings. What I would say is that we have to remember that they are always a proxy. So they are not the same thing as quality. They are a proxy for what we're trying to get our arms around. And they will be imperfect because of that. And any ranking and any measurement exercise always raises questions about validity, reliability, and neither. And the interpretations will continue. I think the healthiest part of what's happened to us in this community is that we've started to have that conversation, and it means that we will continue to debate those points. The risk would be that we foreclose too quickly on a set of indicators that we think we know will serve us best and not keep the conversation active. So I'd like to just make a broader point that we're not alone in this debate. So Australia has been having conversations about this since the RQF began a number of years ago, and then ERA became the son of RQF. And other countries have also been having those same discussions. A recent study investigated the approaches to research assessment that have been adopted in 5 different countries: the Netherlands, Ireland, the UK, Denmark, and Australia. This was a paper that came out in 2009. And the opinions of senior research administrators, librarians, and researchers were canvassed about the different research assessment regimes that prevailed in the various countries. 3 questions emerged as core considerations across all of those countries that were trying to embark on those. And I think it's important to return to that. For me, any measurement exercise ought to always be informed by what I call the so what factor. What are we trying to measure? What are we trying to achieve? And why are we doing this? So the first is there a need to assess the quality of research outputs? And I know that that probably seems like a moot question, but I think it's still worth putting on the table. And if so, is it better to control the process centrally or to devolve it to individual institutions? And around the world, that question's not settled and certainly has different points of view. Secondly, if research assessment is deemed to be useful, then what form should it take? Who pays for it? How complex? How often? What's captured in that? And the third is, should outcomes be explicitly linked to the distribution of funding? And that's not necessarily a given. And if so, should investment reward existing excellence, which was certainly the case in the UK, or should it build emerging areas of excellence, or some combination of both? So there's a lot still to examine and debate and discuss as we think about what we might do with respect to future rounds of ERA. I'd like to say a little bit about bibliometric indicators, because there's been some recent criticisms again about these in particular. And it's important to remember that bibliometric indicators are measures of impact, especially as they're described in terms of citations. And we know that marketing, publicity, good and bad, sometimes the worst research is the most cited, and accessibility heavily influence citation rates. But these in themselves have nothing to do with quality. So we have to remember this. I guess a simple analogy would be, if we did an assessment of the number of viewers who watch television programs, you would get an indication of the popularity of a television program. It would not necessarily tell you which were the quality programs. So are measures of impact suitable, and are they sufficient proxy indicators for quality? Now, the Times Higher Education rankings in 2010 came under considerable scrutiny last year, I guess it was around September, because the results were so difficult to believe. In other words, there were some real questions about the face validity of those. Harvard came through as #1, and everybody felt fairly relaxed and understood that one. But the London School of Economics dropped down to 87th place, and people thought that was a bit unusual. Warwick didn't even feature in the top 200, nor did the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So that started to raise some discomfort for people about what this number was starting to mean. An examination of the reason for some of these changes was the following. There was an overweighting on citations, which accounted for 32.5% of the total weightings. They assigned too high a weighting to a single criterion, chose only one indicator to measure it, failed to take precautions against self-citations, and used a threshold that was far too low. Now, all of those things are things that we're trying to come to terms with, and so the discussion paper will invite us to consider what the risks are. And this is where we need to really be conscious of the policy settings and the objectives that we're trying to reach for as a nation, as we try and make claims and understand the quality of the work we do, and the detail that may be embedded in some of our exercises that may not deliver on those outcomes. Now, I'll just highlight some limits, but be prepared. I will say some positives too, so just stick with me. In terms of limits, one of the limitations has been identified is the fact that any ranking exercise such as this, because we're using proxy indicators and because you've got to make it practical and manageable, by nature can become incomplete and narrow. A particular era and other rankings similar have been criticized for being poor or having difficulty in assessing interdisciplinary work. And when one thinks about the problems that we are facing on the planet and the accountability that we might need to be called upon to deliver on with respect to questions about energy, food security, water, to be asking us to assess quality in terms of very narrow discipline definitions or sub-discipline definitions may not be the correct trajectory for the quality assessments we're after. There's also a risk that these exercises can be prone to data manipulation. The problem of teaching to the test can start to emerge, and we started to see this very quickly. People were very quick to say, what are the rules, how can I adjust, how can I massage them, and how can I participate in a way that's going to optimize my results. You'd expect people to want to optimize results, but it can also feed some unhealthy behavior if people start to narrowly focus on those indicators. And in the past, I would always agree with my colleague Edwina Cornish to say, stick to your knitting and do good quality work, and good work will save the day. But we do have to be aware that sometimes the shape of those kinds of measurements can result in some unusual outcomes, as was seen with the Times Higher Ed results. You can also get citation clubs, and that's not a good thing. So we need to be very aware that those kinds of behaviors happen because people do want to make sure that their work is well regarded. There can be the problem of conflating quality with impact, and it becomes a sloppy shorthand, and we really have not fully assessed what the quality might be. And we know that this work has penalized some disciplines and sub-disciplines, particularly in the case of practice-based disciplines where the work may be received, be read, and be implemented in practice, but would not, and really be making an impact in terms of the outcome for people's health, for instance. But because practitioners don't write and cite each other, the citations are low, and therefore some subdisciplines are not well served. Or an example of studies that are particularly unique to our country. that aren't cited by other countries because the work is quite specific. They may be underserved by this kind of narrow assessment approach. The other thing that's important to remember is that this work is output versus outcome focus. So outputs are the things that emerge as a result of the research that's done. It doesn't tell us anything about the extent to which that work has made a difference in terms of some of the bigger picture questions. Has it changed the way we understand the economy? Has it changed the way we understand energy, clean coal technology, health outcomes? They're also very easy to misinterpret. Exhibit A, the Australian article that appeared within 24 hours of the ERA rankings. And I know that there wasn't a wish for those things to be produced, but as soon as people produce numbers, you'll see a league table emerge. And what you saw there, and anybody with a glimmer of experience in mathematics would know that there are all sorts of errors when you take averages of averages of averages. And what you saw was the kind of league table that again raised questions about the validity of the indicators, because very narrow universities or colleges were listed as world class when it was hard to understand how that could be the case. As well, a subset of the submissions were examined to create the averages that did not allow us to look closely at what assumptions were made to collect those. And outliers were all over the place in a pretty untested set of numbers. So to me, there were some real issues. The problem was that people who were well served by that league table picked it up, reinforced it, and it started to pick up a momentum of its own. Another question, I guess, around the interpretation is, if you look at that, notwithstanding ANU, which has a very specific history, the best predictor of ERA performance was the age of the institution, 0.69. So when my Vice-Chancellor at Curtin said to me, Linda, how can we improve our rankings? I said, could we just age more quickly? That was it. But it really is, and I'm not being glib here. The point is, if we had done an ERA assessment exercise 20 years ago, UNSW probably wouldn't have featured highly. But you've seen what UNSW has done over the last 20 years in terms of achieving world-class research performance. And therefore, it's very important to think about how those numbers are interpreted and the extent to which those numbers lock in the future of universities that are on an upward trajectory. And we may create some links to funding that produce unwanted consequences, and I guess that's where I would put some warnings out. A few other negative consequences before I get to the glass half full part of the conversation. I think it's a concern that the results may be disconnected and the exercise may be disconnected to a range of universities' missions. And what we've heard through the policy settings has been an endeavor to try and create more horizontal diversity across the sector, where people should be good, universities should be good in the things that they can be good in. And yet in actual fact, by measuring everybody the exact same way in very narrow discipline clusters, we have created hierarchical rankings, vertical hierarchy. So we have to look carefully at the extent to which we might have some colliding policy settings that need further examination. And there may be some disincentives to collaborative work that have been created through this exercise. So it's a question, and I think it's a bit of a warning that we might think about, especially in such a small country with the need to build research capability more broadly. The costs of administering have already been highlighted, and we have to look at a return on investment and how often we might do this versus invest in research. And one of the consequences, and this is not unique to ERA, I'm talking about this with respect to any research assessment exercise, is that these exercises may not align well with the values of, quote, the academy, if I can use that old-fashioned term. So questions about curiosity and inquiry and problem solving that allow some scope for academic freedom and inquiry may not be well served by an exercise that tends to focus on narrow, precise measurement that alludes to productivity and what people might therefore be coaxed or encouraged or prompted to study. I'll never forget a book that I read in the early stages of my PhD, I think by Pollyanny, which is on philosophy of science, which was quite a compelling book that's been used years and years following. And he said in his acknowledgements he would like to thank the university in the UK for the 9 years that it allowed him to undertake this book, write this book. So again, that notion of time and the extent to which we get ourselves on a bit of a treadmill in terms of productivity, which may in fact be counterproductive to good quality and thoughtful work. So how do we, as the Academy, not push away the request for accountability or respond to that, but also balance that with the need for thoughtful, measured consideration and the provision for people to undertake inquiry that we may not always be able to predict ahead of time. Positive, here we go. The positives would be that I think there was increased recognition for the creative arts through this exercise. I think previously within the country there had probably been less of a valuing of that area, and so that exercise did prompt some discussion amongst the Creative Arts Academy, Humanities and Social Sciences themselves. I also would caution any interpretations about any definitive judgments about how the country performed in the area of social sciences. We had a peer review system in many cases versus the more, quote, objective assessment, and I think there's some measurement error that needs to be considered before we make too firm a generalization. There, I think, has also been an awakening about the need to energize and internationalize our research as we think about where we fit into the globe and where our work contributes. Perhaps it has amplified our endeavors or our consideration for more engaged international research collaboration, which I would believe is a healthy thing. It has prompted, I think, a culture of continuous improvement, and so there is a pressure to reflect, look at whether what we're doing is worthwhile versus hobby research, and make sure that we're on a positive pathway. I think one of the most helpful things is it has created a vigorous and healthy meta-conversation about research itself. What matters? What is quality? And that in itself has been something that has required us to be much more explicit about what we believe is important. And has probably made research activity more visible and potentially more highly valued if we do this right as a sector. A few other positives. It might make it more difficult to confuse research showmanship with quality. And I know as a DVC at research, sometimes I would have at least a few hundred people telling me how they are world class. So it's always nice to have a bit of an external measure to let me know whether that's true or not in such a wide range of disciplines. It's also important to reveal what is not measured. So it has, I think, pointed us to the question of how do we measure quality teaching? How do we start to look at outcomes, and do we look at outcomes, or are we going to continue to put that in the too hard basket? Or is that the most useful thing that we as a sector might offer in terms of our accountability to the public, to measure the outcomes of our research, not simply the extent to which we cite each other? And it also has prompted the academic community to better explain the importance of research to the wider community, and I think we have a responsibility to do that. Universities Australia has called upon us to do that, and I think we do have a requirement to be able to explain why this work does matter. A couple of things going forward, 2 points of view. One, what might we consider as a sector, and then what might individual universities take as we proceed with this exercise. As a sector, I think it has given us some opportunities to profile and value our research excellence. So the data that Professor Larkins showed us about the breadth of research capability is, to me, one of the most compelling things that we should remember. There is a lot of activity going on, and it is of a high standard, even if we take into account some degree of measurement. There's good work going on across a wide range of areas, and I think that's cause for celebration, and I think we need to be championing that as a nation and look for opportunities to build collaborations that build on that excellence. I think we also, as a sector, need to call upon each other to ensure that interpretations are fair and complete and don't just suit us for the moment, because ultimately we are the stewards of our universities and of the research enterprises that are occurring within the sector, and we need to make sure that we create a strong long-term framework that will continue to fairly assess the research that's being undertaken. We need to recognize areas of emerging research excellence and invest in the future. So I would be concerned if we took the results from Era 2 or Era 3 or Era 4, whatever version we will have, and started to simply reinforce areas of research excellence without providing some sort of way of reinforcing, building, and growing the UNSWs of the future. And I think we do need to tackle the question of outcomes. As individual universities, I think we need to remember our mission. We've been asked to sign up to mission-based compacts, and I think it's therefore important that we continue to push the sector and talk about the policy settings that allow these two worlds to coexist. If we don't, I think we're leading down a path where we're going to have one foot on either side of the river, and sooner or later someone's going to fall in. So we need to remember, we have regional universities, we have smaller universities, we have young universities, we have universities that are more industry engaged, and we need to think about how their missions and how their contributions can be valued while still being able to provide some sort of independent assessment of the quality of the work that's been undertaken. We need to reflect more explicitly about what constitutes excellence, and I think that's helped us internally to have some dialogues about what research looks like and how to mentor people to understand that. I think we need to look at building capacity so that we are preparing the next generation to participate in the future worldwide. Recognize where the talent is and treasure that, and make sure we don't have a brain drain to other places, and seek opportunities to collaborate nationally and internationally. And my last point really is to ask a question really. Are ERA results really the best indicator of excellence, or is there an opportunity to examine the extent to which ERA results, if unpacked carefully, could give us an index of collaboration? My colleague, Professor Robin Owens, and I talked when I was in WA about the extent to which there was overlap in our submissions to ERA, because UWA and Curtin collaborated so much. And it started to raise questions for us about what we were really measuring here. And we might then consider the extent to which the outputs that were counted and produced by researchers from multiple universities, not only within Australia but as well, the universities overseas, and across discipline boundaries were actually indications of good collaboration. And so the question is ERA a proxy for research collaboration? And I would put to you as a question for discussion, in a small country with limited resources to invest in research, a collaborative interdisciplinary reward structure that reaches for excellence through a collaborative model may actually build in some very nice safeguards around quality protection that could serve us best. So I'll pause and look forward to the discussion that follows. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, and to the Centre for the Study of Higher Education and the L.H. Martin Institute. I thought I would actually begin with an MCQ. So the MCQ is, which of the following is out of place? The Academy Awards, the Nobel Prize, the Football Hall of Fame, ERA, or Lotto? And the answer, of course, is Lotto, because the other four are all telling an imperfect truth. And we've just heard Linda elegantly describe some of the pitfalls of ERA as an exercise, and to my way of thinking, it's not too dissimilar to other types of measurement that we as a society embark on using soft criteria, imperfect methodologies to arrive at utterly dogmatic conclusions. Why do we do this, and what is the point of trying to measure excellence in research? It's important to reflect on this because this is why it matters, and this is what will, I think, drive some behaviours and cause some people to take notice. We do it to justify the return on investment, not just from the public, but from other parts of our economy, from industry and private players. We do it to assess strengths across the sector and to rank performance. We do it missing big chunks of the sector. We miss parts of the public research sector, principally the CSIRO, which is the largest research organisation in the country. And we miss a vast number of medical research institutes, hospitals, centres, think tanks. They're just not measured. It is all about the higher education sector, and yet as a community, a small country, we are inextricably linked to each other. And in my discipline, medicine, our relationship with the hospitals and medical research institutes is very deeply integrated. And so it's a pity we missed that. We do it to provide some international benchmarking, although as an exercise it's very inward looking, but one imagines that if you know where some of the landmarks are in the universities you're measuring, then you can second guess where some of the others might lie. And we do it to identify gaps in capability, and perhaps the most terrifying part is we're going to send money in the direction of the people who score best in this endeavour, or at least that's likely to happen. Now, what are the measures of excellence? There's a lot of redundancy in the way we measure this, and in some of the hardcore sciences, I think if you were to run a principal components analysis or some kind of reductionist analysis, you'd probably find you only need to measure one or two things. But we measure all of these in one way or another. Grant income being a strong predictor in the sciences, a poor predictor, I think, in the social sciences and humanities. Publications, policy documents, citations, measures of esteem, national committees, learned bodies, etc. We don't measure, in the current era, translational impact. We don't measure very well paradigm shifts, major shifts in thinking. And we don't explicitly measure how the work we do drives public debate, public discourse, the intellectual life of the nation. And I think there's a very interesting article from a young philosopher in the papers on the weekend. Some of you might have seen it. And I was quite taken by his comment that education at its heart is a civilizing activity. And I think so too is research, a civilizing activity. These are the measures. They're a little redundant. They overlap. They're better for some disciplines than others. They're very weak in certain disciplines, but they're all we have to play with. I worry that some aspects of what we do are not measured, explicitly not measured in a way that I think sort of screams at you a little bit, because they're things most of us in academic life treasure. We treasure knowledge for its own sake, and adding to the body of human knowledge for its own sake. And whilst that's measured in part, it's not sort of carved out in any way as being terribly important, nor is scholarship, just the depth of knowledge that we hold in our higher education sector, the repository of thinking and logic and discipline, and nor is sort of diversity. And Linda mentioned earlier how interdisciplinary research is one of those areas we're not very good at measuring yet, and it's falling a bit through the cracks in the ERA exercise. And yet the mantra we hear from funding agencies, from many universities, from many big institutions overseas, is that major breakthroughs in the future are going to come when different disciplines combine to look at a problem from a different optic and arrive at a solution that is in some way synthetic and new and original and creative and different from the solution any one of those disciplines alone would have come up with. I think one of the big drawbacks of trying to measure research excellence is the lag in the indicators that we're using, so that the research itself might take a few years, and it could take a lot longer than that. We all know that. It takes a little longer to get to the publication stage. It can take a long time for citations to accumulate, and if we're going to measure impact, we really need a generation or more to be able to measure some sorts of impacts. So very much we're looking backwards when we do this, and of course it's very hard to look forwards on issues like this, but we're measuring what we were doing at some 3 to 10 year time point in the past, and it's an interesting observation, Linda, that the single biggest correlation with high ranking in the era is the age of the institution, the sort of historical roots and the depth of the networks that play back into this time lag aspect of what we're trying to do. Now, I thought it would be worth just mentioning very briefly that we're not the only ones, of course, to have tried this exercise. New Zealand got into all sorts of trouble because their approach ended up drilling into individuals. And so individuals ended up, with a kind of barcode on their forehead that said, okay, not so good. Very, very confronting way of trying to assess, the contribution and performance of a whole sector. In the UK, they tended to end up with the unit being the department, and that allowed a direct comparison between departments in different universities across the country, which of course led to the type of game playing that has become legendary, where star researchers and their team, holus bolus, were poached from one university to another at massive cost, simply for the purposes of shifting RAE rankings, because they mapped specifically to departments and you could gild the lily with these large importations of talent. The British have moved, of course, now from their old RAE, which has been around for 20 years, which is widely considered, incidentally, to have improved the quality of research in the UK. A lot of people will tell you, and my friends in the UK who initially opposed the whole idea will look at me in the eye and say, yes, absolutely, it's cleaned out a lot of dead wood, it has transformed research. When you actually look at some of the measures of research in the UK, they certainly shoot up from about the time of the RAE, but in fact the same measures do quite well in Australia over exactly the same period. Parallel, and a couple of rungs down, but parallel, and we didn't have an RAE. So attributing cause and effect is a challenge always with these big policy levers that we're pulling to try and change behaviours and improve quality. Now, I think it's very interesting that the Americans don't bother with any of this. They're really, they're latecomers to the whole idea of rankings. They're latecomers to H-indexes and citations. It's a bit of a surprise to me that a lot of my American friends just sort of shake their head and say, well, we don't really care about that much. They will get infected. It's inevitable because numbers are compelling and they're just magnetic and you can't stop yourself. And so they will get infected. But one of the key reasons they don't bother is that they have a system whereby when you get the grant, you get the indirect costs at the same time. And so one of the drivers for understanding quality is perhaps to determine how indirect costs might flow. What kind of boost are you going to give those that are doing really well, and what kind of penalty are you going to impose on those that aren't doing well? Well, the Americans, the indirect costs go with the direct costs. And so they've been a bit less inclined to embark on this exercise. The other reason, of course, is they just know they're good. And they are, by and large. So it's interesting that you see these differences in the overall approach. And as Linda has pointed out, and there's no need to rehearse them, any measurement exercise will change behaviours, will induce perverse outcomes. And there are a couple here that I think haven't been mentioned. Distorted research patterns, I think the concern for me would be people would play it safe. People aren't going to take risks anymore. People aren't going to go out on a limb when they're being measured, analysed, and money depends on the outcome. I think the way we measure ourselves still doesn't deal with the career interruptions that typical female researchers have. We haven't quite sorted out how to deal with particularly parochial research, Australian studies of one kind or another. Certainly with the dropping of the journal rankings, there's a chance for the discipline committees now to reinterpret what is good and what is great, acknowledging that there is some Australian research that will never get published in the American Journal of anything because it shouldn't be there. It should be in an Australian journal, and it might be world class, but it's not in a world-class journal because of our size. And so that's just a quick snapshot of some of the concerns that I have. Others have already been raised. The last couple of points I'll make relate to the way we measure ourselves in the ERA exercise, and we've chosen to do it by discipline. And Frank's been over the different categorisation, the two-digit field of research and the four-digit field of research. Just worth remembering that these fields of research are defined by the Bureau of Statistics quite a long time ago. And so they're very imperfect in terms of their description of scholarly activity. I mean, for instance, there are fields, you know, that exist now that didn't exist 10 years ago. And that will be a constant feature of any research landscape. But it does mean that there are these sort of unintended outcomes that we have these fields of research, we have journals that are assigned to fields of research so that you can be in education and be assigned to social science. You can be in other disciplines, and in this example, engineering, and you can be coded as physics. And so you can end up with very distorted perspectives on the strength of a discipline because of the way we have chosen to use these fields of research and assign journals to particular fields of research. Now, in the latest 2012 era, there is some capacity to override that. I haven't had a chance to go over the document which just arrived today, but it'll be interesting to see to what extent we can reassign some researchers' work back to their cognate discipline and not in the one that they happen to publish in. The important issue here being that if Era 1 and Era 2 are going to be comparable, then we should try and make it apples and apples. And so I think we're going to have to be careful. But just as an exercise in the complexity of the way researchers' work maps, this is the field of biochemistry and cell biology, 0601, and you can see the vast number of departments, schools and faculties that have contributed to this code at the University of Melbourne, and this will be true for universities across the country. So that when the professor of biochemistry and molecular biology gets told, well, you guys didn't do that well, did you? It's actually not those guys at all. It's the discipline. And so we have to be really, really careful. And the same applies in other areas. Education is another area where you have to make a distinction between the department or the organisational unit of the university and the discipline. Now I'll just end by telling you the story of the NHMRC grid of death. So the National Health and Medical Research Council, which is where I've got my money all my life, decided a few years ago they would have an Excel spreadsheet with an algorithm with all of these measures of esteem, exactly the same ones that are used in the ERA, your citations, your publications, your journals, measures of esteem, etc., etc. And it was a big exercise to fill this in, and you got points for each thing, and at the end of it all you had so many points, and that determined your quantum, determined the amount of money you would get. And anybody could work it out in advance. And it was called, for those reasons, the grid of death, because you'd have a young researcher who'd want to join your grant, and they were great, and they would be a great fit, and it would be a wonderful collaboration. But when you did the calculation, they weren't going to get any money, which meant that they were going to get your money. And so very often the shape of particular program grants was completely distorted by the way in which the individuals who contribute to the grant were assessed. And I think we have to be very careful about these perverse behaviours that we might drive as a result of the way we measure ourselves. Thank you.
So now we're just going to rearrange the furniture a little bit and bring the chairs up here, remove this, and open session. I would ask you all to in fact, identify yourself and the question, or if you want to make a comment, keep it relatively short.
Rob Saint from the University of Melbourne. I was struck, these are things I've heard before, but re-struck, I should say, by various comments. One from Jim saying that the improvement in research in the UK is not necessarily attributable to their ranking exercise, their assessment exercise. I wonder if you could think about and talk about how we will know whether this has been worth $100 million or not. How would we actually have any idea whether it's been worth that?
Well, if you go back to what are the drivers of this measurement, and if you impute, and we don't know really, but if you were to sort of conclude that a key driver is convincing our political masters and the public about the return on investment and the importance of what we do, if we continue to get funded, if we continue to get supported, if we continue to get revered as a very important part of our society, that'll be a success in its own right. And I'm speaking as someone who had a very interesting trip to Canberra to ask the Prime Minister and the Treasurer not to cut medical research funding. It just shocked me that they would even consider doing that. But they did, and they were serious. And they were going to take $300 million out of the medical research budget, most of which is forward committed through grants and fellowships, which meant that they were going to take away nearly every red cent available in the next round, which meant, hundreds and hundreds of jobs for young scientists, for young early career researchers, mid-career researchers. So that's one way we'll know. I think the other way we'll know is if we see successive improvement where the way we measure ourselves is comparable from one cycle to the next. If we do see improvement, I think we have to accept, as I said earlier, it's an imperfect science. It's a very imperfect truth we're shooting for, and we know the pitfalls, they're rehearsed, but it's not all nonsense. And that we have to accept that there are some measures here, as rough as they are, and as inappropriate as they are for certain disciplines, are telling us something, and if we see improvement, then that'll be another way we'll know. I'm sure my colleagues can add to that.
Fine. Other questions? Surely must people. Yes, please. A microphone is coming. Just a moment. Yes.
Maybe while it's coming, I could just add a little bit, because I agree with your comments. I think it will be about the extent to which there is ongoing investment in research and science. If we're not doing that, then we're not doing our job as a sector, and I guess that's why I framed it as what do we do as a sector as well as individuals. I guess the other one I'd be looking at is, are we growing critical mass in research in this country? Or are few people still doing some very, very good work? And if we look at the complexity of problems that we're facing, I would be examining what's going on in the rest of the planet, and you see a growth in the number of shared authorship. Some papers internationally, it's going up, which some would, I guess a jaundiced view would be that there's some sort of gamesmanship going on. On the other hand, it's happening so consistently that you'd have to think that there is some merit in that interdisciplinarity or that cross-fertilization of ideas. The other would be, to what extent does this indicator triangulate with other measures of quality? And so if it doesn't, we would have some explaining to do. And I think we'd have to look at a whole set of indicators to say, to what extent are we able to attract other international research income? How do universities perform on other measures of excellence? And to what extent do those line up? And if they don't, then we've created a system that may be going down a track that's not as helpful.
Yes, please.
Margaret Mazzolini from Swinburne. There were some comments in there about collaboration, and it's somewhat related to the interdisciplinary work you're just talking about then, but that were interesting. Frank was commenting about possibly adverse effects, I think, briefly on collaboration. And then Linda brought up the other example, the Curtin WA collaboration, and talked about how much is it a measure of excellence or of collaboration. I'd just be interested in hearing the panellists talk in a little bit more detail about what they think the effects of at least Era 1 are on collaboration and whether the system can be tweaked to improve the outcomes in that area.
Perhaps I can start. I think one of the key issues when you talk to ministers and so on about this area, I mean, they make the point that if you look at the expenditure we expend on research in universities, it's now nearly $7 billion a year, which looms as a very large sum. It's a high proportion of what universities spend. 35–36% of all the money spent in universities is actually spent on research. And so this whole question of how do we convince the politicians and the community that this is a good investment, and so they do say, well, we do want some metrics. Whatever you, and my colleagues have pointed out, that wherever you turn in the world to look at how things evaluation, there are shortfalls, and so no single measure. It's like the international rankings, so people pick and choose between which one they want. I actually think it's a positive thing that we have 5, 6, 7 rankings around the world, because at least you can point out that none is perfect. This whole question, I agree entirely with what Linda and Jim have said about we are very problem oriented now in research, and many of the problems in interdisciplinary research, we need teams, and not many universities can put together within their own university the team that they need across disciplines to actually solve those nationally and internationally important problems. One of the things I worry about is that if we get too metric driven and internally driven, that we will actually put up barriers to these sort of collaborations. So there is a challenge for us to actually be accountable, I think, to the community, to the politicians, but equally to make sure that the system remains flexible enough. Because, as I tried to show briefly, I mean, there is excellence in every university, and there's great diversity in the system, and we want to foster that, and we have to be a bit careful that in fact this exercise is not used by government to actually narrow the research profile. I think we do want to allow for the early career researchers, my colleague has said, disadvantaged people who have career interruptions, for example. There are many areas where we do need diversity, and I think universities do need to have enough discretionary money, and most have very little at the moment, but enough discretionary money to invest in their future where they see there's excellence. But others, it's just...
Thank you. I was a panel member of RAE's 2008, the area that covered education, psychology, and sports sciences. And there are 3 points that I wanted to make. One, that it was quite clear that there was no such thing as a secret definition of world standard. The approach was really to let it develop out of the ways in which refereeing process worked, instead of trying to prescribe a definition and then sort of apply it to specific So that's one point. The other point, that I think there was quite a great deal of concern within the panel that that RAE was being used by managers, research managers, at the departmental level, not necessarily at the university level, to drive output rather than outcome. In other words, huge number of things were being published. Many of them needn't have been published because there were only 4 papers that were required, in over a 7-year period. And there was a great deal of frustration within the panel about how it is that we can drive a message that highlights outcome rather than output, to use your distinction. Mm-hmm. And the third thing that was really quite interesting was that there was a great deal of confusion about how to ensure that interdisciplinary work could be captured by the exercise when many of the people who were assigned to be panel members were not all that sympathetic to it.
Those are all valid points. I think we have to think carefully about who we're doing this for. And on one level, we need to do it so that we can justify that the investment is fine. But that's the simplest low-level one from my point of view. This is public money that's being invested in universities to undertake good quality work, and it really should be leading to some improvement for society. And if we're creating rules and incentives that simply improve our quality of life, I think it's really quite concerning. I think back to the days when there was a quest for the BRCA1 gene, the breast cancer gene, and the women with breast cancer were asking questions about, to what extent is collaboration happening in the world? Because if it isn't, you're letting us down. Because if an answer can come more quickly by collaborating, that's better. My view is, having lived and worked in 3 countries, the United States, Canada, and here, and you're right, looking at the United States system, there's some excellence, there's some error there, but what there is a quest for excellence. There's a transparency. You know who are on the review panels, they're held accountable, and there is an enthusiasm to foster research in the next generation, to make sure that you build a serious cadre of people coming forward, because that's your best bet to improve quality. So I'd be looking at all of those high-level indicators to make sure the systems really do foster that kind of openness, transparency, and collaboration, and make sure that we're not getting too narrow and simply counting things that make our own situation better today.
One of our challenges in the Australian higher education sector is most universities are stuck in a growth model, that to survive they have to keep growing. Which is antithetical to the quality versus quantity argument. And it's one of the great challenges I think we face as we move to 40% participation, 20% SES. And under a budget system and a base funding model where we have to basically cross-subsidise domestic students with the fee from full fee-paying students, mostly overseas, that cycle is killing a lot of institutions. And Melbourne is struggling to sort of not continue with the growth model, to constrain its size, in fact even shrink and change the shape of its academy and its curriculum. And it's like turning around the Queen Mary. It's quite a challenge. But what I always tell my students about quality versus quantity is, I say, Beethoven wrote 9 symphonies, Haydn wrote 100. Hum me a Haydn symphony. Now, every now and again I get a smart student who does.
Could you say something about the role of publishing industry and how that might be a driver for the judgments and assessments of quality? In social sciences, the number of journals, outlets, have doubled in the last 15 years.
Well, publishers are in the news at the moment, aren't they? They wield too much power, full stop. I mean, in the biomedicine area, Nature Publishing Group, Cell Press, dominate huge chunks of the sector and can make or break careers on whether they accept a paper or not. And so you end up with all sorts of behaviours around calling up editors in New York and London and making pleadings, and it's pathetic. And it's because a handful of very powerful publishing companies have got the high-impact journals and the clout to basically convert people's careers, win them that fellowship, get them that grant. It's a concern that we have.
There's also literature that's criticising more recently the bibliometricians, if that's a good word, and who's holding them accountable, and how frequently do we need to have these ratings come out? Is it annual really meaningful, but does it create that kind of frenzied reach? to keep measuring and keep looking at what we're doing, and whether that's really going to add any value or not. I think the other question is to take that question that came from the study of 5 countries and explore the extent to which funding, which is getting back to that growth model and creates some perverse behaviors in research managers, has to be tied to that index. So some countries are saying we can do an internal assessment of quality and we'll keep our repositories and we'll make it available, and every 3 years there'll be a national one to give us a check. And funding can be tied to those who do well, or there can be a funding system, as we do in other areas within the sector for teaching improvement, that could say funding goes to the most improved change, so that you start to grow a stronger system, not a few universities that already are doing well. So I think we've got a lot of choice around there that hasn't been explicated in as much detail as could be.
Questions? Richard, your microphone somewhere that's coming out.
Richard James from the University of Melbourne, and I'll come clean and say that I was involved in the data collection for education at this university, and we were rated 3. I have 2 questions. I think the first one perhaps is for Jim. If there is a lottery here, surely it's in the 5-point rating metric. And by that I mean that we have a complex data set that underpins ultimately a very blunt reporting tool. And as we all know, there's a big difference between a 3 that's nearly a 4 and a 3 that was almost a 2 if we don't have any finer grained data. The political differences, of course, between 2s, 3s and 4 are quite significant. Would we be better off if we'd had a more finer grained measure, and is such a measure available to us?
Well, it's a complex question. In the UK, of course, they had 5-point system, and to some degree we've echoed the RAE system. What the UK did, which made your question even more acute, is that the funding windfall for getting a 5 was way disproportionate to getting a 4 versus a 3. And I don't know if the 2s and 1s even got any money.
No, they didn't.
You might be able to tell us.
No.
And so they went the other way, if you like. Not only did they stick with a 5-point system, but they had a very steep incline in terms of the financial rewards for excellence. And it's going to be interesting to see how we go. You know, whenever I'm asked to use the full spectrum of the grade, I still always seem to end somewhere on a 7. So I think in theory, it makes great sense to try and be finer grained, expand the scale, stretch it out a bit more and have a better understanding of the differences, because there probably are differences between people sitting in the 4 band, between each other, differences between sitting in the 5 band. But it is quite a challenge, and you'd be asking the panels already. The panel members that I saw at our university looked like very tired souls at the end of the ERA exercise. So I think there are some challenges in asking them to do that.
Yeah, I agree. I think I mean you can expand the scale, but people tend to narrow. The bottom line, as Jim says, is how is this data going to be used? And I mean, we all are concerned. I mean, the government distributes in the block grants, as we know, now around $1.5 billion a year. It's a huge amount of money, impacts hugely on the profiles of all the universities. And of course it comes in several schemes. I mean, is it going to influence those? Not now, but after 2012, the real question is. And then, you know, there's another question of, you know, how regularly do you do this? I mean, if it's costly and so on, if you know, it seems to me that it shouldn't be done more than about once every 5 years. But what do you do in the meanwhile if you're going to tie money to it? Because, as my colleagues have said, the universities change a lot, and their profiles and priorities of disciplines and so on. So there are many questions that we still have to answer. But I'm not sure a finer scale would actually make a lot of difference in the end.
I reckon we should put more effort into measuring the right thing. I mean, like education was really badly done by. I mean, I should come clean. I'm also, you know, I have a conflict of interest, but I know that education at Melbourne is better than the 3. But that's because a whole chunk of them are sitting in the wrong place in terms of the way they've been measured.
That follows neatly into my second question, if that's okay, Jim. I mean, in various ways, each of you have analysed the problem of the unit of analysis, whether it be the individual or the department or the discipline, if you like. And there are, without doubt, grave problems around the individual and the department being the unit of analysis. I was in New Zealand at one point during their exercise, and people were literally in tears about the ratings they'd received. But to play the devil's advocate, though, arguably, when you move to a discipline focus, as we have with ERA, one thing you do is move it further from the daily lives of the academics who are contributing to that, the ultimate rating. And I think it would be true to say in education, David, that we found it hard to get our academic colleagues engaged in understanding how their work was going to contribute to this rather complex rating. So if you want to drive individual behaviours, aside from institutional behaviours, surely you need a measurement system that people can understand on the ground.
But this exercise, I think, was about evaluating the sector and justifying the sector, by, you know, from within a department of government. And if you want to engage individuals, we do that through the performance assessments that we have within our institutions that guide promotion and salary loadings and various other benefits. So we have that. Our funding system is very research investigator focused. We still substantially have an investigator-driven research system in the public sector. I've been trying to calculate this, and I'll go out on a limb and say I think it's probably over 70% of all funding is still going to projects that are driven by an individual, and the currency for that project getting up is generally around the track record and performance to date and quality of the ideas and the context of that individual. So they're being measured as an individual. So I would say have no fear that they're going to slack off and not worry about this, that or the other. They're on notice, both when it comes to promotion, when it comes to getting your fellowship, when it comes to getting your grant. And so I think it's quite reasonable to turn around and say, well, okay, we got that covered, let's measure the sector.
I'd agree with that. Sorry. No, I was going to just add to the question you're asking about the scale and the numbers. I think what we might look at is what Europe's doing with respect to a multi-rank system. So you have, instead of reducing it down to one number, you have a profile that really describes what this institution is, which could match more appropriately what we're trying to achieve with mission-based compacts. So people say, this is a university, this is how they're performing across the range. Now, on the other side of it is the argument, are 50 poor indicators better than 4 poor indicators? So we still don't know how those will fare. But I think it's worth thinking about a suite of indicators that will give you a richer description about what this institution is doing, rather than trying to come up with, you know, a number for artistic performance.
Yeah, but I think, Richard, that we're probably ahead of the UK in the sense by evaluating disciplines, fields of research, than we are departments. I mean, if I take an area like physics, for example, which I know moderately well, and I've just done an analysis for the physicists, there are 24 universities submitted in categories in physics. As Jim said, some of it comes out of engineering, some of it comes out of the medical sciences, some of it comes out of neurology and so on, because they're involved in brain research. They have people doing very elegant physics-related MRIs and so on. The fact is that physics, if I use the example, by choosing disciplines, we get a perspective that physics is pervading a lot of other disciplines. If we just had an evaluation of physics departments, then we wouldn't be evaluating 24 across the country. We wouldn't get that perspective. And I think we are encouraging, in one sense, multidisciplinarity. If you go and look, a while ago I was with the brain research team here at Melbourne. It's very interesting to ask the backgrounds of those people. You've got physicists, you've got IT, you've got medical clinicians, you've got nurses, the whole lot. As I said before, they're coming at a problem. So my own view is discipline is in fact a better way to go. And of course, remember also at the 4-digit code, as you know, you've got the 2-digit, which is physics, but then you've got 7 other sub-disciplines: atomic physics, nuclear physics, condensed matter physics. So you can actually drill down and get quite a profile across the country that way. So I think that part of what's been done to give us a profile for Australia, I think is a better way to go than what the UK has done. Yes, please.
Brian Dalton, Swinburne University. At the 4-digit code level, I have a concern that the requirement to produce 50 outputs over the 5 years may mean that some smaller research groups around the country won't have their research recognised because they may not actually meet the quantum at that particular 4-digit code level, although of course they'll figure within the 2-digit code level, and I think that would be a bad outcome in terms of not recognising good quality research around the country. Would the panel like to comment?
Well, I mean, yes, Swinburne's a good example. Again, in the chemical sciences, as you would know, Swinburne only submitted at the 2-digit level and didn't submit at the 4-digit level at all, even though it does have good people who are doing some physical chemistry and doing inorganic chemistry. I think in some cases it was a decision made by universities as well. I mean, there was a choice to some extent whether you did submit at the 4-digit level or the 2. I mean, taking your point, you had to have 50 publications. You may not have 50 publications, but even if you did, I mean, my understanding is you could still say, no, we're only going to submit it at the 2-digit level. So as I said, this is an imperfect exercise, and it doesn't tell you about all of the activities in universities that universities chose not to submit for assessment. I mean, there were some areas where in fact universities just said we're not at a critical mass in this area, even though we have some good people contributing, so we're not going to submit at all.
I mean, I thought the whole point of the exercise is to assess quality, not quantity.
Yes.
So therefore, you should be assessing everything, even if there are not that many outputs in a particular 4-digit code level.
My memory of this exercise was we had very little scope to not submit. You could distribute outputs across a range of codes, but you could not choose not to just because you didn't want to. And I think that some universities did that differently. Some universities chose to use it as a benchmarking exercise and make sure that they did put forward as much as they could so that they could get a reading on how they would perform across areas. But your question is a good one, and it's a comment that needs to be considered, and I made it in my earlier remarks about these are the things that start to weight what we understand, whether we weight citations heavily, how we factor in peer review, how we determine what the threshold should be, and how that might be helpful, how that might punish emerging areas or narrow areas. I know, for example, UNE did very well in certain areas of agriculture, as you expect they would. And if you change that threshold in a small university, that excellence may be invisible. And that's not helpful when we're trying to tell people that this is a university that's doing very good work in an area that should be valued. So I think we need to really be taking careful note of the secondary consequences that may not position us well to build research capability for the future and really allow us to participate more actively on the world stage.
Yes, sir. David?
John Hardy from University of Melbourne. Firstly, a comment about the comments been made about the individual unit of assessment in the New Zealand, some negative comments. As someone quite intimately involved with that system, there was a lot of debate about that. And in the debate, it came down to keep with the individual unit of analysis for lots of very positive reasons, despite the negative today. And if you think error is not based on individual, it is. It's just that the New Zealand system's transparent. This one was not. But that's not my question. The concern that I have with these systems, and certainly the experience in the New Zealand one, was the remarkable negative effect on the new and emerging researchers. Over the time, the system there changed quite dramatically to try and deal with that, and I don't see any discussion of that change here. Here's the scenario. If, at the moment, error is reputational based, sometime soon it may be financially incentivised. What is an excellent world-class university? By the definition of error, it is a department in a university where everybody is an A star. I put it to you, is that a world-class department?
Pretty unbalanced department.
How come we're maximising the wrong thing?
I think there was a paper written fairly recently about what is a world-class university, and I think it was written for the purposes of AusAid, when they were thinking about how would, say, the World Bank invest in areas where you had developing countries that are trying to build world-class universities. And I found it very informative to anybody who could read that paper, and I won't probably get the set right, but it was about investing in talent, you know, allowing freedom of inquiry and keeping the bureaucratic structure light touch. Yeah? Infrastructure, sorry, infrastructure was in it. Invest in people, invest in infrastructure, and keep the bureaucratic framework light. And so to me, and I think back about when you say the UK has achieved well. Well, you don't have a control group, so it's really hard to know what will happen over time. I look back to a few years ago when we had a surplus and there was a little bit of tax benefit within Australia given back to us. At that same time, Canada had a surplus and they invested in 1,000 chairs. So I guess these are the questions that I think we need to keep always on the surface. We can get down into the rats and mice about should we count this, should it be 30, should it be 40, should it be this threshold, should we weight it this way? Or should we have an elevated conversation, a meta conversation about what matters and what do we want to spend our money on? And how are we going to invest so that we have a country that is really world class as a system in participating in research across a range of disciplines?
Well, maybe I'm an optimist, but I don't think the intention is to end up with, you know, departments full of professors who are all A-star achievers. I mean, that would be obviously foolish. I mean, we do have the phrase relative to opportunity in our vocabulary in the way we do a lot of assessments. And I think there is a recognition that you do need to have a balanced composition with early career researchers, mid-career, and yeah. Yes, but there are still a lot of disciplines that got fives and they're not full of professors. And I might just add that as a follow-up to my story about the NHMRC program grant Grid of Death, that ultimately they abandoned it. And so in fact they keep the grid, but now the assessors are instructed not to use it in a quantitative way in their assessment and to take into account the mentorship and profile of the group that's being assessed. So there's an awareness there, and that's where my optimism comes from, but we probably won't get it dead right straight away.
Yes, over in the far corner. Thank you.
Hi, Andrew Trounston at The Australian. I just wanted to follow up Margaret's much earlier question about collaboration, and I really would like to know, I can understand why we need to measure collaboration, and it's much fairer to do so, and it's something we need to encourage anyway, but how do you practically go about measuring collaboration? And how would you, the obvious dangers of that are universities freeloading on other universities by collaborating just a little bit and then basking in the glow of that. And also it strikes me that there's a potential here for a recipe where the sector says to everybody, hey, we all collaborate, hey, we're all as good as each other, isn't this great? And I don't know, is that the purpose of ERA? So how would you practically go around, you know, measuring collaboration?
Well, Let me start by indicating, I mean, we have had a history of probably more than, 2 decades now with the cooperative research centres, for example, which was sent a signal back in 1990 from government saying we do want the sectors between universities, public agencies and basically the industry to collaborate. I think that it's mixed results, but nevertheless that there have been some good collaborations out of that which have led, and it depends on how you want to measure it, the kind of graduate students we've produced. Many of them have had a different perspective on their careers, and these are things that are hard to quantitatively measure, but students have come out of cooperative research centres with a different perspective. You look at, Linda mentioned before, the joint authorship that's occurring is steadily growing within Australia, but also between Australia and international. And interesting now, one of the biggest growth areas is collaboration between Australians and people in Asia. And one of the reasons it is because we have so many international students that are doing graduate work here, and they have links back to their home universities and so on. To me, you could use that. Our centres of excellence that the ARC has promoted have been built upon, again, a critical mass. Typically, they expand across several universities. So I think while we don't have a single measure, as my colleagues have been saying, there's no perfect measure, I do think that over a couple of decades now, we've done a number of things in Australia to try and send positive signals for collaboration. And while there will always be competition between universities, that's understood. I think we are, those people that are research administrators and leaders of universities are generally pretty encouraged by the fact that where it does make common sense to collaborate, we do see a lot of collaboration taking place. One of our real limitations, as we know, is that the level of industrial and business R&D in Australia is very limited, and so it really is hard to build that collaboration. In the sciences, for example, big companies like BHP Billiton no longer have research labs in Australia. Rio Tinto no longer have research laboratories in Australia. They used to a couple of decades ago. So structurally, we've got limitations to direct collaboration with some industries, but the small SMEs as such, who don't have a lot of money to put into research, but actually do have a lot of interest in the research outcomes. There's a lot of good work goes on at that particular level, but my colleagues know.
I think you asked the question, how do you measure it? The easiest way to measure it is joint publications, joint supervisions of research high degree students, joint patents and jointly held grants. And we do actually capture many of those metrics, and we can even drill in and look at international collaboration across the same parameters. But can I just perhaps suggest that the idea of universities collaborating, for the hell of it because it makes us look better, is in practice not realistic. The energy of activation of a collaboration is high. To get to a point where you really are doing something with another team or individual, requires to break through a trust barrier and a complementarity barrier and an opportunity cost barrier because you're doing something with them that you could have been doing on your own, and a fair amount of additional energy after that initial threshold. And so I think real collaborations are actually quite demanding, and they're a bit of an art. And the second point I'd like to make is the driver has to be improved quality. And we know that the average citation of papers that have international authors on them is higher than purely Australian authors. That's an example of what, evidence that international collaboration helps. And I tried to understand a while back how what the average number of authors was on a biomedical paper, and it gets very messy because if you count those big genetic consortia, you get a very big number. If you leave them out, you get a number that's still over six authors per paper. and probably higher, depending on which discipline. If you go in, some genetics papers have 206 authors because they're pooling samples from all over the world to get the power you need to answer the question you're asking. But we have a lot of incentives for collaboration. Linkage grants are all about collaboration. The collaborative research networks that were created in by the federal government just recently announced are all about, you know, group of 8 universities collaborating with non-group of 8 universities to try and drive the sector together, because it wasn't happening at a very high level on its own. Just a few comments.
I guess the only thing I would add is my view is, yeah, we should be doing it for the right reasons. It should be for reaching for quality, and the chances are that you've got more checks and balances to see whether the work's really sound. Going back to your point really is about what's the unit of analysis. If we continue to focus on grading universities by themselves, it doesn't contribute to fostering collaboration. And so if you look at systems that exist elsewhere in the world, there can be some more active incentives that would promote collaboration across areas that might be multidisciplinary or interdisciplinaries or disciplines. And then we say, Australia is known for these areas of excellence. And that pie chart that looked like University of Melbourne, all contributing to the biochemistry, actually is a pie chart that looks at the number of universities that really are contributing to areas of excellence within the country with their international partners. And so what I guess I'm posing is a more accurate story of some of the work that's really going on, rather than some false assumptions around comparing groups when in actual fact you're counting the same things.
We have time for 1 or 2 more questions. If there, Richard, right down the back.
Dick Harcourt, Chemistry. Some years ago, Peter Singer wrote, "In former times, an academic was rewarded for thinking up exciting new ideas on little money. Now an academic is rewarded for thinking of plausible ways of spending big up front." To what extent is that those propositions relevant today?
Well, I think in the sciences, there has definitely been a shift to team-based research that's infrastructure dependent. You know, you can't do it without a machine that goes ping, and any machine that goes ping costs $1 million. And that is a reality of for a lot of science-based investigation in the engineering, physical, and biological sciences. It's a difference between 50 years ago when Barbara McClintock was in a lab, looking at maize and looking at the different colours of the kernels and working out that genes could jump all on her own. It just doesn't happen very much anymore. I mean, there are case studies, but they're outliers. So the Barry Marshall story, the discovery of Helicobacter, the cause of peptic ulcers, and N equals 2, Barry and Robin Owen, they discovered this in a hospital pathology lab, 2 people working together, no money. They couldn't get a grant. Barry has framed the letter from the NHMRC saying, sorry, but it just wasn't good enough. So they're fascinating, romantic case studies, and they do reflect a time when science was about creativity and ideas, more than than big sort of powerful algorithm-based grunt. Sequence it, clone it, express it, mutate it, create an animal that's got it, commercialise it. That's the modern algorithm. One of my favourite cartoons in nature was a picture of Charles Darwin walking around his house, Down House in Surrey, hands behind his back, head down, and the caption said, "Charles Darwin in the now largely extinct activity of mulling over his thoughts." We don't do enough of that anymore.
We've got time for one last question.
Maybe I could just add, I think there are some protections that can be put in place, and I guess that was a warning that I was offering, that we can get on this efficiency, productivity, chase the dollar treadmill. And there can be systems where we look at, for example, is is the NHMRC funding research, and do they quarantine any funding, or ARC for that matter, for more high-risk research? NIH has done that for years, so that you don't get that safe behavior. And I think there are some things that can be examined so that you don't build those kinds of structures in that lead us to unimaginative work that's not there for the right reasons.
So a final question over here. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Erica Smith. I'm from the University of Ballarat. And I've been puzzling over a statement which I'm not sure whether I misunderstood, but I think, Jim, you made it, where you spoke about the growth in universities and the government's participation targets. And I think you said, but I may be wrong, so please contradict me if so, I think you were implying that the growth in student numbers at universities was actually a problem for the quality of research. And if that was what you said, can you explain how you think that link happens?
It was more a comment about the perennial growth cycle we're locked into because the base funding of undergraduate students, at least in our university, is inadequate for what we're doing. And that pushes us as a sector, and in the past in the University of Melbourne as an individual, to enrol more and more fee-paying students to pay cross-subsidise the domestic students. Now, as you get to a certain size and a certain teaching burden, and I think inevitably, as we take a much greater proportion of students from low socioeconomic backgrounds who are less prepared for higher education than the more fortunate private school kids, higher education, higher SES, we are going to have more demands on the sector. It's going to be tougher to teach these kids. It's going to take longer. We're going to have to put more effort into it. And in a teaching and research model, where the majority of academics are trying to do both, the penalty will be on the research side. And certainly I think, and this is a gross generalisation and you can shoot me down, but I see the teaching loads and the effort that's gone in to teaching in our university at least, and my colleagues in other universities, growing rather than shrinking, and that inevitably will impact on research productivity. And a surrogate marker for me in our university is to see how many of the very successful departments in their research agenda have done so by stacking the department with research-only scholars, with independent fellows who've got their own fellowships from various government sources and from industry, and who have no obligation to teach. And if you look at the medical research institutes that I know in forensic detail, there's no question that they're publishing at a higher level than many of their equivalents in the university sector, because they have no teaching, because they don't have these problems. So when you add it all up, I think there is a trade-off going on in a broad, generalist kind of way.
Okay, well I think that we're drawing to a close. It just leaves it for me, firstly, to thank you all for coming, and I hope you found it informative. Richard, so it's being recorded. Is it going up? What's happening to the? You might tell us about.
It'll be on the LH Martin and CSHE websites soon.
So if you want to follow up on various aspects of it, it'll be there for you and to share with your colleagues. The second thing I did want to do was to, I see Lynn and Richard here. This, as we've said, has been sponsored by the LH Martin and the CHEC as a part of a series, and just to congratulate you both on this series. I think it is important that we have frameworks for policy discussions of this kind, and also the people behind the scenes, your staff that I know that organise that. Could I thank them for that? And finally, to thank my two colleagues for I think both incisive presentations that have certainly left us with a lot of questions about the importance of the whole exercise that they're in. So thank you all, and perhaps we'll thank colleagues in the usual way. Finally. Thank you.